Since this universal is equally at the disposal of the virtuous consciousness and the way of the world, it is not apparent whether virtue thus armed will conquer vice. The weapons are the same. They are these capacities and powers. Virtue has, it is true, held in reserve its belief in the original unity of its own purpose and the essential nature of the way of the world, a reserve that is intended to fall on the enemy from the rear during the fight and in principle to achieve that aim. As a matter of fact, therefore, the knight of virtue's own part in the fighting is, strictly speaking, a sham fight, which he cannot take seriously, because he knows that his true strength lies in the fact that the good exists absolutely in its own right, that is, brings itself to fulfillment. A sham fight which he also dare not allow to become serious. For what he turns against the enemy and finds turned against himself, and what he runs the risk of wasting and damaging both in his own case as well as that of the enemy, is not to be the good itself, for he fights to preserve and accomplish that. What are risked in the fight are only the gifts and capacities which are not themselves at issue. But these are, in fact, nothing else but just that very universal in which individuality has been nullified, which is supposed to be preserved and realized by the conflict. But at the same time, this universal is already realized directly by the very notion of the conflict. It is the in itself, the universal, and its realization means merely this, that it is at the same time for an other. The two aspects specified above, in accordance with each of which it became an abstraction, are no longer separated. It is especially in and through the conflict that the good is established in both modes. The virtuous consciousness, however, enters into conflict with the way of the world as if this were something opposed to the good. What the conflict offers to it is the universal, not merely as an abstract universal, but as a universal animated by individuality and existing for another. In other words, the actual good. Therefore, wherever virtue comes to grips with the way of the world, it always hits upon places which are the actual existence of the good itself, which as the in itself of the way of the world is inextricably interwoven in every manifestation of the way of the world. And in the actuality of that in itself, virtue has its own existence, too. For virtue, therefore, in the way of the world is invulnerable. All the moments which in virtue itself were supposed to be risked and sacrificed are just such existences of the good, and hence are inviolable relationships. Consequently, the conflict can only be an oscillation between preserving and sacrificing, or rather there can be neither a sacrifice of what is one's own, nor a violation of what is alien. Virtue is not merely like the combatant who, in the conflict, is only concerned with keeping his sword bright, but it has even started the fight in order to preserve the weapons. And not only can it not use its own weapons, it must preserve intact those of the enemy and protect them against its own attack, for all are noble parts of the good on behalf of which it went into battle. We come now to this long paragraph, number 386, where Hegel depicts virtue as in ascendancy, and by the end of the paragraph it turns out that virtue is, you might say, on the ropes, if we want to use this fighting terminology. He uses other fighting terminology. He talks about weapons and about something almost like a duel taking place between virtue or a conflict or a war. And you notice that we've got the same sort of schema as last time with this universal of the gifts, the powers, the capacities, the, Fähigkeiten and all of those sorts of things. Everything that we have, and these are individual, right? We saw in the last paragraph that the individual is poised, you might say, in between the virtuous consciousness whereby they willingly subordinate their own individuality to what it is that virtue demands, what virtue wants to bring about in the world. Or they lapse into the way of the world, which is just a whole slew of individualities arranged in different ways. Here, Hegel will make a contrast between virtue on the one side and vice on the other, or if you like, goodness and badness or evil. Now, where the problem is going to arise is that goodness turns out to be more widespread than virtue originally took it to be, which in a certain way is good news for virtue, isn't it? But on the other hand, is bad news for virtue itself in its particular configuration and its conflict with vice or the way of the world, selfishness, individuality, all of those sorts of things. Now, there's a lot happening in this paragraph, but we can chart it out all using this schema. So he says, since this universal, that's what's being contested, right, is equally at the disposal of the virtuous consciousness and the way of the world, either one can make use of it. Either one can make use of these capacities, these, gifts, whatever it is that individuals actually have. He says it's not apparent whether virtue thus armed will conquer vice, whether virtue is going to triumph or not. You remember last paragraph, or the last several paragraphs, we were talking about virtue as having something like a comportment of faith or belief, Glaube, right? That's part of what's going on. And virtue thinks that by having that, it's holding it in a reserve. Now, this is a military term, literally that which is held back from the action, the conflict is happening here. You hold back a certain amount. You don't throw everything into the conflict so that when your opponent starts to weaken or tire or make mistakes, you can send your fresh troops in sort of an encircling movement around the back or the flank or whatever you want it to be and hit them when they're not ready, and thereby you win. So he goes on and he says the weapons that these two have are the same, right? They're these capacities and powers. Virtue has held in reserve its belief in the original unity of its own purpose and the essential nature of the way of the world. So what is this reserve? What is this holdout? What is this secret ace in the hole, as we say, in poker terms, an advantage? Well, virtue has this belief in its original unity, its ursprüngliche Einheit, of its own purpose, of its Zweck, its goal, its end, it's what it is that it's to be, right? So it thinks of itself as, I'm not like all that tawdry, mundane stuff that happens over there. I'm something better. Now, does it have evidence that that's the case? No, because it's trying to bring it about at this point. It has faith that that is the case. What else does it think it knows? The essential nature of the way of the world, the essence, the Wesenheit of the way of the world, the way the way of the world is. And let's remind ourselves, what is the way of the world? Well, in a certain sense, it's that universal ordering that we saw, which is unjust, unfair, based on all sorts of arbitrary characteristics. Who gets to choose things, who gets to decide. It's not always on the basis of who the most capable person is or, who merits it or anything like that. And everybody is sort of out to get, what it is that they're looking for, oftentimes at cross purposes, but that all combines into this way of the world. So he goes on and he says, as a matter of fact, therefore, the Knight of Virtue's own place in the fighting is, strictly speaking, a sham fight, which he cannot take seriously. Why can't he take the fight seriously? He should be taking the fight seriously, right? If it's sort of up for grabs at the beginning of this chapter, and then virtue has this secret reserve that it's going to bring to bear that the way of the world can't even suspect. Virtue says, I don't have to devote everything. I've got this in, just waiting. And so it doesn't fight in the way that it ought to. And it may, in fact, find out, as often does happen in military engagements, that the moment of opportunity was lost, that you actually should have committed your reserve earlier on. So he says, the Knight of Virtue's own part in the fighting is a sham fight. Why? Because he knows that his true strength lies in the fact that the good exists absolutely in its own right. This is a very important passage here. Let's repeat that. He knows that his true strength lies in the fact that the good exists absolutely in its own right. What does that mean? It brings itself to fulfillment. This is something that is going to happen over and over again. We've already seen this a number of times in Hegel's text, if the good cannot become actual, it is not really yet the good. The nature of the good is to become actuality, to externalize itself into the world, to reshape the world around it after its fashion. Now, sometimes when that happens, as we've seen in previous sections, it turns out that the good isn't completely good, that there's unforeseen consequences, we could say, or unintended consequences. This is what we call dialectical development, right? So you have an idea, and as an idea it looks really wonderful. As you go to apply it, things start getting much more messy, and sometimes it turns out that what you thought was good actually turns around into something quite bad. But right now, virtue thinks, I've got this. Goodness has to prevail, and I'm on the side of goodness, right? I'm goodness itself. Now, that's not going to hold up for very long. So he goes on and he says, what he turns against the enemy and what he finds turned against himself are these things. These are the weapons, the gifts, the powers, the capacities that are wielded by individuals, wielded in individuals. The individual has to decide, am I going to devote these to virtue, to its demands, even though that may mean leaving behind my own pleasure or my own, hankerings of my own heart, the law of the heart, or whatever else it may be, my own advantage. Am I going to use these capacities that I have for that, or am I going to use them in the arena of the way of the world and thereby become part of the way of the world? That's what the individual has to decide, and that's where the conflict is taking place. So he says, what he turns against the enemy and finds turned against himself, and what he runs the risk of wasting and damaging, both in his own case as well as that of the enemy, is not to be the good itself. For he fights to preserve and accomplish that. So where is the good itself? It's not yet. We're going to realize that this is the good itself. But right now it looks as if the good itself is not yet there. So where is the good itself to be found? Well, it turns out that when we go to look for it, it is going to be in this conflict itself. This leads us to a very important point about virtue as Hegel is describing it here. And let me remind you one more time. We're going to talk about this, in just a few more paragraphs again. This is not virtue as it would be understood, say, in Plato or in Aristotle, or even arguably in the Stoics, although an argument could be made there. This is virtue as understood in a particularly modern way, where it becomes a bit deracinated, where people try to purify virtue and extricate it from its social settings and to say that we're going to aim for the good itself. So this is virtue not so much even as, say, Hume would talk about it, although Hume has a pretty debased conception of virtue, reducing it largely just to socially approved traits, and more like what somebody like Kant might make of it, or indeed somebody like Rousseau. Virtue is understood here as moral goodness that has been purified of the dregs of individuality, of pure subjectivity, of interest, of all these sorts of things. So, what happens in the conflict? He says, these are, right, the gifts and stuff, nothing else but that very universal in which individuality has been nullified by virtue, which is supposed to be preserved and realized by the conflict. Virtue, and this is a problem with virtue, right? Virtue in the modern sense can really only exhibit itself and know itself as virtue and thereby discover itself in its conflict with the way of the world, which means that it is, as Hegel puts it here, for an other. And insofar as it takes over this part, this is also for an other, which is to be understood. Individuality is for another. It's not purely in itself. To be an individual is to be in part connected with the rest of the world, standing out against the rest of the world, right? So he goes on and he says, this universal is already realized directly by the very notion of the conflict. It is in itself the universal, and its realization means merely this, that it is at the same time for another. So, here we get a classic Hegelian reversal. The two aspects specified above, what are the two aspects? Virtue and the way of the world, in accordance with each of which it became an abstraction, are no longer separated. They're together in conflict, to be sure, but they're also together in another way. He says, it is especially in and through the conflict that the good is established in both modes. So there is the good here, but there's also the good here. That seems to be a problem, right? Because that's not what we started out with. This is where we see a dialectical transformation. We have what we call determinate negation going on at this point, where, not everything is being negated, but something that was an important quality in the entire structure here has now been turned on its head. So he goes on and he says, the virtuous consciousness enters into conflict with the way of the world as if this were something opposed to the good. That's where we started, right? What the conflict offers to it is the universal, not merely as an abstract universal, but a universal animated by individuality and existing for another. In other words, what he calls the actual good, the wirkliche Gute, right? The real, we could say too, if we wanted to. The real good, the good that has been realized. Why would that be the case? Well, again, remember, if the individual is wirklich, real, and the individual subordinates, subjects himself, allows himself to be nullified by virtue so as to be the virtuous consciousness, it is the individual that is doing that. And it's not the virtuous consciousness that thereby becomes good. That's already good in a trivial sense. The individual becomes actually good by doing so. It is through, not just by thinking to yourself, oh, I would sacrifice for humanity. I would do wonderful things if only I was given the opportunity, the means, right? The gifts, powers, and capacities. It's what one actually does, whether you go out and do something to the person that you encounter on the street, or the people that you're living with, or the people who you are, for the time being, stuck working with, or whatever it happens to be, right? That's how you extricate yourself from the way of the world in a concrete fashion, not a purely ideal fashion. So Hegel goes on. And he says, therefore, wherever virtue comes to grips with the way of the world, it always hits upon places which are the actual existence of the good itself, which as the in itself of the way of the world is inextricably interwoven in every manifestation of the way of the world. Now, that is taking us beyond merely an individuality. What it's saying is that within the way of the world, we have all of these individualities, each of which has its gifts, its capacities, its powers, its possibility for virtue. And each of those, insofar as they are like that, are also something good. And so it's not as if we have just, the good guy over here and everybody else is a bad guy over here, just part of the way of the world. As a matter of fact, everybody over here is living sort of a double life. In a sense, they're bad because they're following their self-interest or their, if we want to be conscient about it, their happiness, right? And what is happiness? The satisfaction of all of our desires and inclinations, which is subjective. There is a certain general ground to it, but it's not pure, it's not universal in the way that Kant wants it. But what Hegel's recognizing here is the way the world is now revealing that it's made up of all these goods, actual goods, right? Individualities that are actual goods, wirkliche Guten. So he goes on, and now this leads to a problem. he says, in the actuality of that, virtue has its own existence too. For virtue, therefore the way of the world, is invulnerable. Virtue was going to come and use this reserve to attack the way of the world. And now it turns out that the way of the world isn't really vulnerable to virtue. Why? Because virtue only strikes down what is bad, what is evil. It will enter into conflict, but only strike the blow where it's needed. So insofar as there's some goods, some actual goods, in all those individualities comprising the way of the world, it finds itself paralyzed. And that's the virtuous consciousness that finds itself paralyzed. You want to change things in a fundamental way, and then you find out that those that you're fighting against aren't really as bad as you thought, and you're incapacitated against them. So he goes on, and he says, all the moments in which virtue were supposed to be risked and sacrificed are just such existences of the good, and hence are inviolable relationships. Consequently, the conflict can only be an oscillation, a going back and forth, not a resolution, between preserving and sacrificing. Or, rather, there can neither be a sacrifice of what is one's own on the side of virtue, nor a violation of what is alien. So here's where Hegel has a really interesting metaphor. In martial arts, a lot of times in martial arts we're not actually fighting with weapons, we're using our body. And that would be more like what Hegel's talking about here is capacities, right? And you get people who like to, train a lot, but when it comes time to actually spar, let alone to actually go into a fight, they don't want to, they'll throw punches and kicks, but they're not really trying to connect. Why not? Because maybe they'd hurt their foot or their hand or whatever. Or maybe the opponent doesn't really deserve it. Well, you're not going to be a very good martial artist if that's what you're doing. And that's what he calls a sham fight. So Hegel here talks about virtue being like the combatant who in the conflict is only concerned with keeping his sword bright. He doesn't want to get it nicked or notched, right? Or let alone covered with blood. But it goes beyond that. He even started the fight in order to preserve the weapons. That's a little bit different. Right? It got into the fight for a purpose that contradicts what you've got the weapons for in the first place. There's this Civil War general who, there's an old story, and I don't remember which general it is, but a young cavalry officer found this general sharpening his saber before a battle. And the young officer was like, man, this guy, he's a general. He shouldn't be doing that. He's never going to use his saber. Why is he bothering with that? He's wasting his time. So he goes up to him, like young people are prone to do, and he says, sir, what are you doing there? And, they have a little conversation, and it ends with the general saying, fighting is for killing, son. Namely, if you're going to have weapons, they're to be used, right? That's the point of having weapons. That's the point of having these capacities. If you're holding everything in reserve, going into a combat just to try to preserve that reserve and never actually using it is not a very good strategy, is it? So he goes, not only can it not use its own weapons, even beyond that, it must preserve intact those of the enemy and protect them against its own attack. For all are noble parts of the good, on behalf of which it went into battle. Insofar as it discovers the goodness, various goodnesses, actual goodnesses of human beings in those who are a part of the way of the world, it cannot take action against them. So, like I said, it's paralyzed, it's ineffectual. Now, this is going to be a problem, right? Because isn't virtue supposed to be the good precisely by actualizing the good?